The crack in the mountain face was no wider than a man's shoulders, hidden behind a curtain of old juniper growth that pressed against the granite, like it had been growing there since before memory. A person could walk past it 100 times and never once know it was there. The geese knew. That was what puzzled him most, not the vanishing exactly, but the certainty with which they went. Every afternoon, when the light dropped behind the western ridge and the shadow of the mountain stretched long across the meadow grass, the flock would lift from the creek bank in a loose honking wave and move together toward the tree line. Not skittered, not drifting. Together, with the calm, unhurried purpose of animals who understood exactly where they were going and had understood it for a very long time. He had watched them do it 3 days in a row before he mentioned it to her. She had been splitting the last of the garden beds into winter furrows when he came down from the upper meadow and stood at the fence post with his hat pushed back and that particular look on his face, the quiet, working look that meant something was turning over behind his eyes. It was October of 1881, in a narrow valley in the western reaches of Wyoming Territory, where the mountains came down steep and close on both sides, and the land between them was rich enough to farm, but far enough from everything else to make a man feel, some mornings, that the world had simply forgotten to include him. They had filed on their homestead claim the previous spring with $43 between them, a wagon, 2 mules, and a small flock of Toulouse geese his grandmother had pressed on him before he and his young wife had set out from Missouri. She had told him that geese were the most practical bird a homesteader could own, hardier than chickens, useful in ways that would surprise him. He had believed her, mostly because his grandmother had never been wrong about the practical things. The geese had done well enough on the creek meadow grass. Better than well, actually. They had multiplied faster than he expected, and by October the flock numbered close to 40. That alone was something. But they had also begun, without invitation or explanation, to disappear every afternoon into the juniper scrub along the base of the mountain cliff, and to come back in the early dark quieter than they had left, full of some satisfaction he could not name. She listened to him describe it, her hand still holding the fork, her breath making small clouds in the cooling air. "They come back?" she asked. "Every one of them. Same direction each time. Same crack in the rock." She looked up the slope toward the tree line, where the cliff face caught the last angle of afternoon light, and the junipers stood dark and close against the stone. "Then we ought to follow them," she said. He had expected her to wait until morning. That was what a sensible person would do. Let the geese lead the way in daylight, with proper tools in hand and a full stomach. But she was already setting the fork against the fence post and wiping her palms on her apron, and he recognized that particular set of her jaw. She had made up her mind in the way she sometimes did, quietly and completely, like a door pulling shut against a wind. They went up the slope together in the last of the afternoon light. The grass gave way to scrub and loose shale, and then to the juniper belt, where the trees grew close and the ground smelled of dry resin and cold stone. He had been up here twice before, checking on a stray, but he had never pushed far into the junipers themselves. The branches caught at their sleeves. Somewhere above them the cliff rose sheer and pale in the dimming sky. She found the crack first. It was not much to look at. A vertical seam in the cliff face, perhaps 18 inches wide at its broadest, narrowing toward the top where two slabs of sandstone had shifted against each other, sometime long before either of them was born. The junipers grew thick in front of it, which was why a person walking the meadow below would never notice it. The soil at its base was soft and pressed with the clear marks of webbed feet, dozens of them, coming and going, a worn path no wider than a child's handspan cutting straight through the rock. He pressed his hand to the stone beside the seam and felt air moving against his palm, warmer air, coming from inside the mountain. She crouched down and looked in. He watched her eyes adjust, watched her expression shift from careful attention to something quieter and more private, I can hear them, she said. He crouched beside her and listened. From deep within the crack, barely audible over the evening wind moving through the junipers, came the low murmuring sound of settled geese. That satisfied, half-asleep gabbling that meant a flock at rest, not frightened, not restless, comfortable in the way of creatures that had found exactly the place they wanted to be. How far back does it go? He asked. No way of knowing from here. He looked at the width of the opening, then at his own shoulders, and said nothing. She was slighter than him by some measure. She looked at the crack the same way he did, calculating. Tomorrow, she said, we come back with a candle and we see. He agreed, though some part of him wanted to press himself through the stone right then, in the dark, with no light and no plan. Instead, he put his hand against the warm air, still breathing out from the crack, and held it there a moment, the way a person might hold a hand near a stove to confirm the fire inside was real. The geese murmured on, somewhere beyond the stone, patient and utterly unconcerned. They came back the next morning before the dew had lifted off the grass, carrying 2 tallow candles, a tinderbox, and a coil of thin rope she had thought to tie around his waist before he pressed himself into the stone. The geese had already slipped through, one by one in the gray pre-dawn light, the way they did every afternoon and apparently every morning too, moving with that purposeful single-file patience that had first caught her attention weeks ago. He struck the flint and got the first candle lit on the third try. The flame steadied. He held it near the crack and watched which way it bent. It bent inward, drawn by whatever air moved inside the mountain. That was a good sign. It meant the space breathed, meant it was large enough to have its own weather. She tied the rope around his waist herself, checking the knot twice. He handed her his hat, turned sideways, and pressed himself into the opening shoulder first. The stone was cold, even in summer, and it scraped against his back and chest at once, so that for a moment he was held by the rock on both sides and he had to breathe out and push and work himself forward inch by inch. The candle flame guttered. He cupped his hand around it. The passage was no more than 18 inches wide at the tightest point, and the tightest point went on for nearly 4 feet before the rock gave way and the space opened, sudden and enormous, around him. He stood still and lifted the candle. The ceiling rose above him into darkness he could not reach with the small light. The walls fell back on both sides into a chamber that seemed in that first breathless moment to have no edges he could identify. The floor was dry stone, smooth in places, ridged in others where old water had worked its way across the surface long before either of them were born. And there were the geese, 40-50 of them, moving calmly across the chamber floor and settling into shallow depressions along the far wall. Utterly unbothered by the candle or by him, she called from outside. Her voice came through the crack strange and close, like a voice heard through a wall. He called back that he was standing and that she should come through. It took her longer than him, only because she was more careful, moving the candle she'd lit for herself ahead of her, through the crack first and then following it. When she stood beside him and raised her light, they stood together in silence for a full minute, turning slowly, letting the 2 small flames push back what darkness they could. Along the base of the far wall, in rows so orderly they looked deliberate, were eggs. More eggs than either of them had words for in that first moment. Pale and large and nestled into the stone hollows as if the mountain itself had been keeping them. She reached out and took his hand without looking at him. He counted without meaning to. It was the kind of thing a man does when his mind cannot quite accept what his eyes are telling it. He counted, moving the candle slowly along the base of the wall, and the number climbed past anything reasonable. 20. 40. He lost his place and started again. She had moved in the other direction, crouching low, holding her flame close to the stone floor to see how the depressions had been formed. Not dug, she said quietly. Worn smooth by water maybe, or by birds over a long time, she couldn't be certain which. The stone was pale gray and dry now. worn into shallow cups, just the right size to cradle a large egg without letting it roll. She touched one, then drew her hand back and looked at him. He shook his head slightly. Not yet. Not without understanding first. The geese moved among the eggs with a calm that surprised him. He had kept geese long enough to know they could be quarrelsome creatures, territorial and loud when startled. But these moved through the chamber the way a congregation moves through a church before service, unhurried, purposeful, certain of their place. Several had already settled into depressions of their own, tucking themselves down in the posture of birds intent on sitting. Others wandered toward a far corner where the floor was slightly damp, a thin seep of water running black and quiet from somewhere in the stone. She touched his arm and pointed upward. He raised his candle. The ceiling rose higher than he had first guessed, pulling away into darkness beyond the reach of either flame. But what caught his breath was the shape of the place, how it widened as it went up, the walls sloping outward in a way that gathered warmth rather than letting it escape. He could feel it. After the cold of the hillside and the sharp squeeze through the crack, the air in here was almost mild. Not warm the way a fire makes a room warm, but steady, the kind of temperature that doesn't change. She said it before he could find the words for it. It holds, she said, like a root cellar, but bigger. Like something built for exactly this purpose, only no one built it. He thought about that for a moment. He thought about the first frost that had killed their garden, and the second one that came before they had finished salting the pork, and the weeks between October and March when the valley offered almost nothing, and every family on the ridge counted days by what they had left in, storage rather than by the calendar. Thousands of eggs, she said softly, and she wasn't guessing anymore. She was measuring, the way a practical woman measures a room before she decides what furniture it can hold. He looked at her in the candlelight. Her face was serious and still, the kind of still that comes just before a person makes up their mind about something large and irreversible. Neither of them spoke the next thought aloud yet, but they were both already thinking it. He reached out and touched the nearest wall. The stone was dry, which surprised him. He had expected damp, the kind of seeping cold that ruins stored food and breeds mold in cloth, but the surface was almost dusty under his fingers. He moved the candle closer and saw thin striations in the rock, layers pressed together over time beyond his counting, and he understood, without needing to be told, that whatever water had once shaped this place had finished its work long ago and moved on. The chamber had been sealed into patience. She was already walking the perimeter, stepping carefully around the geese that watched her with calm, unhurried eyes, measuring with her feet the way she measured cloth when they had no tape. He watched her lips move quietly as she counted paces, east wall to west, north wall to where the chamber narrowed back into solid stone. She turned and held up her fingers. 40 feet, she said, maybe more. He looked at the ceiling, high enough to stand without stooping, high enough that the candlelight didn't quite reach the top of it. He thought about the smokehouse they had planned to build before the money ran short. He thought about the dairy cellar that the Hendersons down the valley had dug themselves over 3 summers, hauling dirt out in buckets, shoring the walls with timber they had milled themselves, and how even that cellar only held a fraction of what he was looking at now. This is already built, he said. She looked at him. That was exactly it. That was the whole of it. Someone else had once spent years digging, or nature had done the digging across centuries, and either way the work was finished and the result was standing right here, waiting in the dark under their feet while they had been up above, scratching at poor soil and watching frost take their garden. She knelt beside a cluster of eggs near the far wall, the ones farthest from the crack, the ones the geese apparently considered most settled and permanent. She lifted one carefully and turned it in the candlelight, checking it the way she checked eggs from their yard hens, tilting it slightly, looking for the signs she knew. Her face gave away the answer before she spoke it. Some are fresh, she said. Some are older. We would have to sort. he nodded. They had sorted worse by worse light. She set the egg back with a care that was almost ceremonial, and then she stood and turned slowly, looking at the whole chamber again, the way a person looks at something a second time when they are no longer just seeing it but beginning to plan. Inside it, the geese settled around her feet as if they had always known she belonged there. He thought about the neighbors. He thought about the way Aldous Prentice had laughed at the fence posts. He thought about what this valley would look like in January when the last of the smoked meat ran out and the root cellars went thin. Then he thought about 40 feet of steady, unchanging cold. He did not say any of it aloud. That was the thing about the two of them that their neighbors had never quite understood. They did not need to speak, every thought to share it. She was already moving along the near wall, pressing her palm flat against the stone, testing its temperature the way you test a skillet before you set the butter down. He watched her and understood. She was measuring the chamber the same way he had measured it in his mind, not as a wonder to stand inside and admire, but as a resource to be understood, mapped, accounted for. The cold was the first fact. The second fact was the eggs. The third fact, which neither of them had yet said, but which was growing between them like something planted, was the question of whether the geese could be coaxed to keep nesting here rather than simply visiting, whether the chamber could become something managed rather than merely discovered. He picked up one of the eggs and held it in both hands, feeling its weight. A goose egg was not a hen egg. It was nearly 3 times the size, rich in the yolk, and in winter, when hens stopped laying and cattle were kept alive on faith and hay alone, a goose egg was worth more than most men in this valley would admit. He turned it slowly. The shell was smooth and pale and unblemished, the way something is unblemished when it has never been touched by hard weather or hard seasons. She came back to him from the far wall. She had counted paces. He could tell by the deliberate way she had walked, lips moving slightly. She told him the number, and he thought about it in terms of square feet, in terms of rows, in terms of what a person could store here, if the eggs were sorted and packed in sawdust or dry grass the way you packed apples for the cellar. The temperature would do the work that no root cellar in this valley could quite manage. The cold here was not the brittle, killing cold of open air. It was steady, reliable, the kind of cold that preserved rather than destroyed. She said they would need to come back with rope and lanterns. 2 lanterns, not one, he agreed. She said they would need to mark the path through the tunnel with something, some method of feinting their way in darkness without frightening the birds. He agreed with that too. She said they should tell no one yet. He looked at her. She was not a secretive woman by nature. She believed in neighbors, in the settling of debts, in the kind of openness that made a community instead of just a collection of separate hardships. So when she said they should tell no one yet, he did not question it. He understood that she was not thinking about keeping something from the valley. She was thinking about protecting something for it, holding the knowledge close until they understood it well enough to offer it properly. He blew out the candle to save what was left of it. They came back 2 days later in the gray quiet of early morning, before the geese had stirred from the frost-rimmed creek bank. She carried the second lantern. He carried 50 feet of rope coiled over one shoulder and a sack of white flour tied at his belt, the kind of flour too old and too stale for baking but still pale enough to leave a visible mark on dark stone. The idea had come to her while she was kneading bread the evening before. She had stood at the work table with her hands working the dough and her mind working the problem, and she had thought about the flour the way she always thought about scarce things, not what it could not do, but what it still could. A pinch at each turning point, a smear on a wall at each fork where the passage bent, enough to find their way back out without depending on memory in the dark. He had said it was a fine idea. He had meant it. The crack in the rock face accepted them the same way it always did, grudgingly, requiring patience, requiring the willingness to turn sideways and trust that the stone would not close around them. The lanterns threw doubled shadows on the tunnel walls. His rope dragged softly behind him, whispering against the floor. She marked the flower at every turn, pressing a small X into the stone with 2 fingers. He counted the steps under his breath, not because the count would help him later, but because it gave his mind something steady to hold on to while his eyes worked in the narrow, flickering light. When the passage opened into the chamber, the warmth and the smell and the sound of it hit them differently than the first time. The first time they had been stunned into stillness. This time they moved with purpose. They walked the perimeter. He paced it out while she held both lanterns overhead, turning slowly to cast the light as far as it would reach. He counted 42 paces along the longest wall. She measured the ceiling with her eye, higher in the center, sloping gently toward the far edge where the stone curved down like the inside of a bowl. They found the second vent that day. A narrow chimney in the far wall naturally formed, barely the width of a man's forearm, through which a cold thread of outside air moved steadily downward. That was where the temperature came from. That was the mechanism of the place. Cold air descending from the mountain above, pooling at the chamber floor, held in by the insulating mass of rock on every side. She pressed her palm near the opening and felt it clearly. She said that with some careful work, they might be able to widen the passage just enough to move things in and out without disturbing the birds. He looked at the walls, at the quality of the stone, soft in places, fractured in others, and said it might be possible. Neither of them said what they were already beginning to imagine. They did not speak their imagining aloud for 3 more days. There was something careful in that silence, something almost superstitious. As though naming the thing too soon might dissolve it, the way frost vanishes the moment a warm hand touches it. Instead, they worked. They measured. They came back to the chamber each afternoon when the geese made their slow procession through the crack, and they moved through the space methodically, the way a person reads a letter twice before answering it. He brought a short iron pry bar and a mason's hammer on the 4th day. She brought a tallow candle fixed to a tin plate, which threw a steadier circle of light than the lanterns swinging from their hands. Together they examined the wall near the passage entrance, the one she had identified as the most promising, and he worked the pry bar into a seam between 2 fractured slabs. The stone gave with less resistance than either of them expected. A chunk the size of a man's boot came free cleanly, and the cold air moved through the new gap with a soft, almost conversational exhale. The geese paid them no mind. That was a thing they had both noticed and quietly appreciated. The birds seemed to understand, in whatever way birds understand anything, that these 2 particular humans were not a threat to the place. The flock moved around them like water around stones in a creek, unhurried, unfrightened. She kept careful count in a small ledger she had carried since their wedding trip, a book she had used for household accounts, mostly columns of flour and lamp oil and nails. Now a new column appeared in her careful hand. Eggs counted, eggs disturbed, eggs left undisturbed. She was building a theory about rotation. Which sections of the chamber floor held the oldest deposits, which held the freshest. How much could be taken without diminishing what the birds returned to lay again? She had always been the one who thought in systems. He was the one who could look at a piece of ground or a wall of stone and understand what it wanted to become. Between the two of them, the shape of something practical was forming. They began to talk about it carefully on the walk. Home one evening, the sun already behind the western ridge and the temperature dropping fast the way it did in that valley, when October pressed close against the mountain. She said that if the passage could be widened to perhaps twice its current breadth, just enough to carry a wooden crate through sideways, then retrieval would become possible without disturbing the nesting areas. He said that a low sled might work better than a crate, something that could be slid rather than lifted. She said a sled. They walked the rest of the way home in the kind of quiet that is not empty, but full of calculations, full of tentative hope, full of the particular shared language of two people who have survived enough hard seasons together to know better than to trust luck, but who are beginning to think this might not be luck at all. The next morning he was up before first light, not to feed the geese. They had learned the geese required very little guidance and would find their own way to the passage and back in their own time, but to study the rock face with fresh eyes and the kind of attention that sleep sometimes sharpens. He brought the hand lamp and a short iron pry bar, and a piece of chalk he had kept since his surveying days, and he stood at the mouth of the crack for a long while before touching anything, reading the stone the way a careful man reads a contract before signing. The crack widened naturally at a point about 4 feet in from the entrance, then narrowed again before opening into the tunnel proper. That narrowing was the problem. It was a band of harder rock, a seam of dark material running diagonally through the softer limestone around it, and it had resisted the slow dissolution that had widened the rest. He marked it with chalk, measured the span twice with spread fingers and a length of cord, and then sat on his heels in the cold morning air and thought without moving for a long time. She found him there when she came out with the morning's first bucket of water, and she did not interrupt. She had learned that stillness in him was not absence but concentration, and she had come to trust it the way she trusted certain signs in the sky. She set the bucket down and studied the chalk marks herself. When he finally stood and told her what he was thinking, a cold chisel show rather than the pry bar, a patient hour of tapping rather than force, the goal being not to remove the band entirely, but to score and fracture its inner edge by perhaps 3 inches on each side. She nodded slowly. She pointed out that the stone dust would need to be cleared thoroughly before bringing any kind of sled through, or the runners would catch. He agreed. She suggested packing damp cloth around the chisel strikes to soften the sound and reduce the chance of a larger fracture spreading somewhere unintended. He looked at her for a moment and then said that was a considerably smarter approach than the one he had been planning, and she said she knew. They worked that afternoon in careful shifts, she holding the lamp and monitoring the sound of the stone while he worked the chisel with measured strokes, neither hurrying. The geese moved past them twice on their afternoon cycle, with the particular unconcerned authority of animals who have claimed a territory for generations and do not recognize human effort as relevant to their arrangements. By the time the light outside the crack had gone to gray, the inner edge of the hard seam had given them those 3 inches on each side. Not enough yet, but enough to see that the plan was sound, that the stone was willing, and that what they were building together, slowly, carefully, in near silence, might actually hold. 3 more afternoons of the same careful work opened the passage enough that she could move through it sideways without bracing her shoulders against the stone. He was broader and still had to turn and exhale and push through with deliberate patience, but he managed it without forcing anything, and that mattered to both of them. A forced passage would mean cracked stone, and cracked stone in the wrong place meant a ceiling they could no longer trust. The sled was narrow. He had rebuilt it from the old wagon bed boards the previous winter, and it turned out those proportions, which had seemed inconveniently slight at the time, were precisely what the crack required. He shaved another half-inch from the left runner, with the draw knife on a cold morning while frost still clung to the cabin grass, and she lined the runner faces with tallow-rubbed cloth strips to help them glide over the stone dust without catching. They tested it empty first, pulling it through the passage with a rope looped around a post driven just inside the outer opening. It moved without sticking. She stood inside the chamber in the lamplight, listening to the sound of it coming through, a soft, steady whisper of wood on stone, and said it sounded like something being born. They had decided to take only what the flock would not miss noticing. That principle had taken them 2 evenings of quiet conversation to arrive at. The geese had never hoarded, never defended. They laid and gathered and nested in a rhythm so ancient and undisturbed that the chamber had filled over what must have been decades of unmolested accumulation. To take recklessly would be to break something that had taken longer than either of them had been alive to build. She was firm on this. He did not need convincing. What they could take were the oldest eggs from the deepest accumulation, the ones layered beneath fresh nesting material, already separated from any active brooding arrangement by the natural organization of the flock itself. She had spent time watching which sections the geese attended and which they simply passed through. There were zones. The far northern curve of the chamber floor held eggs so deeply settled that no goose she had observed had moved toward them in any of their visits. That was where they would begin. The first careful sled load came out on a Tuesday in early November, the sky outside gray and closing with the smell of coming weather. 43 eggs packed in dried grass with spacing between each one, the sled moving through the passage like something slow and deliberate and almost sacred. He set them into the root cellar on a bed of clean straw with the same steadiness he used for everything that required his best attention. She counted them again and wrote the number in the back of her ledger beside a small sketch of the chamber. And then she stood at the cellar opening and looked at what they had and thought about the clouds building along the ridge. The snow came that Thursday. It did not arrive the way early season snow sometimes did, tentative and apologetic, laying itself down in a thin sheet that melted by midday. It came with intention, driven sideways on a north wind that had already crossed 1,000 miles of open country and had not grown tired. By the time the morning light showed itself, pale and indifferent behind clouds the color of iron, there was already 8 inches against the cabin. And the drifts along the fence line had swallowed the lower rails entirely. She stood at the window with her hands wrapped around a tin cup and watched the yard disappear. He was already in the barn, had been since before full light, checking on the geese and making sure the water trough had not frozen through to the bottom. When he came back inside, snow was pressed into the grain of his coat collar, and his beard held small crystals that melted as he moved toward the stove. They did not say much. They had said most of what needed saying over the past 3 days. Which families were lowest on provisions, which of the older homesteads sat farthest from the town road, which neighbors had been too proud to mention their situation when talk turned to the coming winter. She had the list. It was not written down anywhere, but she had it. The second sled load had come out of the chamber on Wednesday, another 41 eggs, and those joined the first batch in the root cellar, on a layer of straw she had refreshed with dry grass brought down from the hay store. 183 eggs now, if she counted everything accumulated since mid-October. More than they could ever have produced from surface-kept birds through a cold like this one. He poured coffee without being asked, set a cup near her hand, and looked at the list she had started writing in the margin of yesterday's page. Henderson's first, he said. The road to their claim runs along the lee side of the ridge. We can get there and back before the wind shifts. She nodded. She had thought the same thing. It struck her sometimes, in moments exactly like this one, how little needed to be spoken between them anymore. Not because there was nothing to say, but because they had worked alongside each other long enough that their thinking had grown into a shape that fit together without requiring explanation. He knew she had already calculated the route. She knew he had already checked the sled runners for ice. They loaded the first delivery carefully, wrapping the eggs in folded cloth and nesting them in the same dried grass she used in the cellar. She tucked a piece of oilskin across the top to keep the wind off. The geese shifted and muttered in the barn as he brought the sled out through the door. Outside, the snow kept falling, steady and absolute, covering everything that had ever been ordinary about this valley. The Hendersons met them at the door before the sled had fully stopped. the old man leaning hard on the frame, his wife behind him, with a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Neither of them spoke when they saw the wrapped cloth bundle. The woman simply pressed both hands over her mouth and stepped back to let them in. There was no grand ceremony to it. She set the eggs on the table and counted out 2 dozen while he waited near the door, not wanting to crowd the small space. The Henderson woman touched each egg as though to confirm it was real. Her husband cleared his throat twice before he could manage a word, and when he did, all he said was that he hadn't expected to see anyone on a day like this. She told him quietly that was exactly why they had come. They made 4 more deliveries before the light began to fail. The Calloway widow, the Brower brothers, both of them thin in a way that made her chest ache. Old person who had been too proud to ask anyone for anything since the summer and who turned the eggs over in his hands for a long time before he looked up. She did not make it feel like charity. She told each family the same thing. The Geese had given more than 2 of them could use, and a debt shared across a valley didn't weigh so heavily on any single back. Most of them seemed to understand what she meant. A few of them wept. On the return run, the snow had softened into something quieter. He drove, and she sat beside him, her shoulder against his, watching the white fields roll past in the gray late afternoon light. The runners hissed against the packed surface. The horse moved at an easy pace, breathing steam into the cold. She thought about the crack in the rock, and the first afternoon she had squeezed through it, half convinced she was doing something foolish. She thought about the chamber, and the smell of old stone and warm feathers, and the way the light from her lantern had climbed the walls and shown her something that did not seem possible. She had not known then what it would mean. She had only known it was real, and that real things could be worked with. He reached over and covered her hand with his, without looking at her, the same easy gesture he had made 1,000 times before. She turned her palm up and held on. They reached their own lane as the last color left the sky. The barn light was a pale glow behind the shuttered window. The geese were settled and still inside. The root cellar held more than enough to carry them through whatever weeks remained. She unlatched the barn door while he unhitched the horse. The familiar sounds came back around her, the low rustle of straw, the warmth of animals, the creak of old timber holding firm against the wind. They had built this together from almost nothing, and it had held.